A city that does not appear on any public map. A place with its own power grid, its own hospitals, its own police force, and a population sworn to silence. It has been operating for decades, yet most Russians have never heard its name. That is not an accident. Welcome to one of Russia's closed administrative territorial formations, a network of cities built during the Soviet era to hide the most sensitive work the state ever performed. One of them, deep in the Ural Mountains, cost the equivalent of $12 billion to construct and sustain. It still functions today. The Soviet Union began building these hidden cities in the late 1940s. The reason was simple and terrifying. The Americans had used an atomic bomb, and Moscow needed one too. Fast. Stalin tasked a physicist named Igor Kurchatov with building the Soviet nuclear weapons program from almost nothing. Kurchatov understood the problem immediately. You could not develop a weapon this dangerous in an existing city. Too many people, too many eyes, too many loose words. So the state did something unprecedented. It built entirely new cities. Then it erased them. The first closed city was called Sarov, though for decades it appeared on no map under that name. The state called it Arzamas 16, a designation designed to confuse. Located roughly 300 kilometers east of Moscow, it was sealed behind double fences, armed checkpoints, and a bureaucratic wall that took years to penetrate even with official clearance. Workers who moved there signed agreements they could not discuss. Their families relocated with them, cut off from the outside world. Letters were censored. Travel required special permits. The city had everything a normal Soviet town had: schools, cinemas, apartment blocks, except freedom of movement, no exit, no mention, no map. Kurchatov visited the site personally in the early 1950s, making decisions about which buildings would house which functions. He was not an administrator by temperament. He was a scientist, impatient, precise, aware that the margin for error was zero. When early calculations suggested that a particular design configuration was unstable, he reportedly spent 3 consecutive nights reviewing the mathematics himself, rather than delegating. That kind of intensity shaped the culture of these cities. The scientists who lived there were among the most educated people in the Soviet Union. They were also among the most isolated. The engineering required to build Sarov in secret was remarkable. Supply convoys moved at night. Construction workers were rotated in under-controlled conditions, then rotated out before they could form a full picture of what they were building. Rail connections were disguised on official transport maps. The city developed its own internal economy, with prices, wages, and distribution systems entirely separate from the broader Soviet state. At its peak, Sarov housed more than 80,000 people. It had its own university, its own symphony orchestra, its own classified library containing documents that did not officially exist. To live there was to inhabit a strange double reality. Outside the fence, the Soviet Union was collapsing through shortages and political upheaval. Inside, the supply of food, housing, and equipment remained relatively stable because the state could not afford to let its weapons scientists grow hungry or distracted. But the real scale of what was hidden goes beyond Sarov. Russia built not one secret city but dozens. At the height of the Cold War, an estimated 44 closed cities existed across Soviet territory. Some focused on nuclear warhead assembly, others on ballistic missile research, others on biological and chemical programs the state never officially acknowledged. The total population living inside these sealed zones reached, by some estimates, over 1.5 million people. 1.5 million people, invisible to the outside world. The city that draws the most attention today is Snezhinsk, known during the Soviet era as Chelyabinsk 70. Located in the southern Ural Mountains, roughly in the same geographic band as Sarov, it was constructed as a second nuclear weapons design center, a backup and parallel facility in case Sarov was ever compromised. The rationale was brutally practical. If the Americans knew where the first facility was, and by the 1960s they had a reasonable idea, then concentrating all design capacity in one place was a strategic liability. Two cities meant redundancy, it meant survival. Chelyabinsk 70 was built faster than Sarov, drawing on the hard lessons of the first project. The construction crews knew better how to move material quietly. The bureaucratic systems for controlling information had been refined. The second secret city rose from the Ural foothills in roughly half the time of the first. Its population reached around 50,000. It produced some of the most technically sophisticated nuclear warhead designs in Soviet history, and it did all of this without appearing on a single publicly available map for nearly 50 years. Then came the 1990s. The Soviet Union dissolved in December of 1991. The bureaucratic machinery that had sustained these cities, the supply chains, the special funding allocations, the ideological framework that made isolation feel like sacrifice rather than imprisonment, began to fall apart almost overnight. Scientists who had spent their entire careers inside the closed cities suddenly found themselves in an impossible position. The state they had served no longer existed. The pensions they had been promised were worth a fraction of their former value, and the knowledge in their heads, the detailed technical understanding of how to design, build, and trigger nuclear weapons, had a market value that was terrifying to anyone paying attention. Western governments and intelligence agencies spent much of the 1990s trying to understand just how porous these cities had become. Some researchers left, some were approached. The historical record on how many defected or sold information remains incomplete and deeply contested. What is documented is that the United States launched a program, the Nun-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, specifically aimed at paying Russian weapons scientists enough to stay in Russia. The logic was blunt. It was cheaper to fund their salaries than to deal with the consequences of their knowledge spreading. By some estimates, the program reached thousands of scientists across multiple closed cities. The cities themselves were partially open during the 1990s and 2000s. Some residents were allowed to leave, some restrictions on mapping were quietly relaxed. Sarov appeared on commercial satellite imagery. Academic papers from scientists at Snezhinsk began appearing in international journals, sometimes with heavily redacted affiliations, but partial opening is not the same as transparency. Today, Sarov and Snezhinsk remain classified closed cities. Access still requires government clearance. Residents still cannot freely discuss their work. Foreign nationals are still barred. The legal framework that makes this possible, the Closed Administrative Territorial Formation Statute, was never repealed. It was updated. New residents move in under the same general constraints that applied in 1952. The reasons have evolved. The secrecy has not. Russia's current nuclear weapons program continues to operate from facilities rooted in this Cold War infrastructure. The scientists working in these cities today are the children and grandchildren of the people who first moved there under Stalin. Some families have lived inside the closed zones for 3 or 4 generations, never knowing any other kind of life. There is something almost impossible to fully grasp in that fact. Children born inside a city that does not appear on maps, growing up with a horizon defined by fences, knowing that the rest of the world does not know they exist. What the Russian state built in the Ural Mountains was not just a weapons program. It was a parallel society, engineered for secrecy from the ground up, sustained across 3 generations, and still operating today. The maps have been updated. The fences have not come down. Whether these cities will ever fully open, or whether they will simply continue as they always have, present and invisible, is a question that belongs to a future no one can predict. The story of these places is still being written.